Can one rise up against a king after swearing loyalty to him? Can one call himself free when every document, every good, every thought is stored in London's filing cabinet? I spent nearly my entire life in an empire where every sail that left the harbor required permission from Britain. Every newspaper page taxed, every teapot part of a chain, every word watched by a gentleman in polished shoes. In 1774, I stood in the halls of the British government beneath portraits of kings listening to humiliation. They called me a traitor. Why? Because I, an American, passed along a letter that was already destined to become fire. I, Benjamin Franklin, once hailed as an envoy of reason, stood in the midst of sarcastic applause as the empire laughed in the face of my hope for compromise. "Your America," they said, "is a whim. You wouldn't survive a week without us." Now tell me, friends, what would you do if someone told you that you were nothing without their permission to breathe? Subscribe to our channel if you enjoy thoughtful, slow-burning history. And tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it there? We're always curious to know where our voices reach. If monarchy is the crown of power, its tax system is the noose around its subjects' necks. When I was still a young printer in Philadelphia, the empire seemed to me like a perfect mechanism, like the great clock on Trafalgar Square, precise, cold, and utterly uninterested in how you felt about it. Britain was the sun that never set, but only because it never stopped burning you with taxes. You might think we colonists were simply buying hats, tea, and silver spoons from London. In truth, we were paying rent on the very right to exist. The Navigation Acts, passed way back in the 1600s, declared that we could trade only with England, buy only from England, and ship only via English vessels. If you grew tobacco in Virginia, you couldn't sell it to Spain, even if they offered a better price. Only to London, at their rate, through their brokers, and taxed per barrel. After the 7 Years' War, which, by the way, was also fought to protect the colonies, Britain found itself drowning in debt, and it decided that we should foot the bill fully. The Stamp Act of 1765 taxed all printed materials, books, newspapers, contracts, even playing cards. If it wasn't printed on official stamped paper from London, it was considered invalid. Then came the Townshend Acts in 1767, a tax on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea, meaning if you fixed a window in your house, you owed a fee to the crown, even for the nails. And finally, the infamous Tea Act of 1793, the cherry atop the imperial cake. It handed monopoly of tea sales to the British East India Company. We had to buy only from them. Again, their prices, their rules. But control didn't stop with our wallets. Britain stepped directly into our homes. The Quartering Act required us to house and feed British soldiers. Literally, a redcoat could be assigned to your living room without your consent, without reimbursement. Admiralty court stripped us of trial by jury. If you were accused of smuggling, and who wasn't really, you were judged by a royal official, not your peers. And the odds of acquittal were about as good as a mouse in a lion's den. Imagine it. You pay taxes, you're tried without a jury, your goods are seized, your home is a military dormitory, and you have no voice in Parliament. No taxation without representation, we cried. Shut up and pay, they replied. I, Benjamin Franklin, still believed back then that it was all a misunderstanding. I wrote letters, negotiated, tried to be the voice of reason. But with every meeting, every rejection, I saw it more clearly. Britain no longer saw us as partners. We were livestock, fueling their golden toilets with our labor. America belongs to the empire, they insisted. America belongs to itself. We slowly began to believe. This was no sudden rebellion. It was a slow suffocation of rights, dignity, and breath, until our only option was not a petition, but a rifle. And that's when the whispers began. Not yet revolution, but something colder. Resolve. Stay with me. The true plotting hasn't even begun. I was never a revolutionary by nature. I was a printer, a man of markets, reason, and carefully worded letters to ministers. I believed that if we just explained to London how absurd their policies had become, they'd come to their senses. But let me tell you what happens to those who still believed in compromise in the 1770s. We were labeled agents of the Crown in America and sympathizers with the rebels in London. I, Benjamin Franklin, was erased from both guest lists. It was the perfect moment to pause and realize the world was changing without me. In Boston, New York, Philadelphia, clubs began to form, half secret, half drunken, fully awake. Not political parties, not movements. They were hives of suspicion, where questions once whispered in private started echoing across entire colonies. Why are we taxed without a voice? Why does Britain decide what we drink and where we trade? Why are soldiers quartered in our homes and our children told to thank them for the privilege? These were dangerous questions, and dangerous questions always find printing presses. Enter Thomas Paine, an unknown name in 1775, but by 1776 his pamphlet Common Sense had sold over 100,000 copies in a population of just 3 million. It wasn't philosophy, it was a cannonball. Why should an island rule a continent? He asked. Why do we obey a crown that treats us like property? Paine spoke plainly. No Latin, no hedging. His words lit fires under wigs and bonnets alike. And in my view, his pamphlet was the first direct punch to the empire's face. At the same time, taverns, once places of gossip, rum, and harvest chatter, turned into hotbeds of heresy. The word republic, unthinkable a decade earlier, now passed between tankards. A world without a king? Without noble titles? It sounded like anarchy, or, just maybe, freedom. Taverns, let's be honest, were the people's first parliaments. Meanwhile, committees of correspondence were emerging. Colonial shadow networks sharing news, letters, intelligence. They were the pre-revolutionary postal service. Every message risked a charge of sedition. Every writer, a future leader or prisoner. These letters, passed between colonies, created horizontal awareness, from Massachusetts to Georgia. And I, Franklin, reading some of them, understood one thing clearly. Loyalty was rusting, crumbling, replaced by a terrifying, seductive idea, independence. We didn't know yet that we were heading for revolution, but we'd stopped looking for a way back. While beer brewed in the taverns, Boston brewed something much hotter. Tea. Next time, I'll tell you how one night on the harbor turned into political theater, and how tea became the taste of war. Believe me, it wasn't a protest. It was a dress rehearsal for detonation. If you think the Boston Tea Party was a cheerful scene, colonists tossing crates overboard with smirks and tricorn hats, Allow me to reintroduce you to reality. It was no party. It was a gut punch to the empire, and we knew it would not go unanswered. Tea was the most popular commodity in the colonies, a symbol of British civility, and the most taxed, the most controlled. The British East India Company was drowning in debt. Their warehouses were overflowing. London's solution? Dump the tea in the colonies, not by invitation, by imperial decree. You will buy this tea, you will pay the tax, and you will be grateful. You've heard of the Tea Act, but few understand its sting. It wasn't just legislation, it was a message. The tea was cheaper than smuggled goods. Sounds generous, right? But every tin came with a silent receipt. I accept Parliament's authority over me. Now picture this. Boston, December 1773. 3 ships, 342 chests of tea, and a group of men dressed as Mohawk Indians. Yes, really, not a costume party. Political theater. If we want London to listen, we must speak their language. Symbols, scandal, spectacle. That night, they boarded the ships. No blood, no weapons, only tea and silence. 342 chests dumped into the harbor. Over 90,000 pounds of tea. A fortune sunk. This wasn't just a protest. It was a ritual destruction of imperial goods. I, Benjamin Franklin, learned of it while still in London, and do you know what I did? I apologized to the government. I offered to pay for the tea, because I knew what was coming next. And I was right. Britain went berserk. Their reply, the coercive acts, which we quite fittingly called the intolerable acts. Boston Harbor, closed. Massachusetts, stripped of self-governance. Troops, quartered en masse. Justice, suspended. This wasn't taxation, it was occupation. And in that moment, the colonies understood. This isn't about tea anymore, it's about survival. When the empire struck back, we started gathering. Next time, I'll tell you how the Continental Congress, a meeting of nervous, scattered, unarmed gentlemen, became the unlikely stage where a nation was conceived. Not from heroism, but from desperation. Getting 13 colonies to agree on anything was like getting 13 cats to sign a lease. In September 1774, 13 colonies decided to meet, not for tea, not for a ball, for something entirely new, a Congress. Ah, Congress. A noble word, isn't it? It sounds Roman, maybe Parisian, full of intellect and structure. But the First Continental Congress? It was more like a barn meeting with ambitions of empire. I wasn't there for the first one, not yet. But I knew what was happening. Delegates gathered in Philadelphia, cautious, furious, and wildly mismatched. Massachusetts, fiery radicals. Virginia, wealthy and calculating. New York, wary, still hoping for peace. The southern colonies, less angry about tea, but alarmed by the precedent. There were no revolutionaries in the room, just lawyers, planters, merchants, doctors, subjects of the crown, who until recently had been writing polite letters begging London to listen. Now picture them at one table, no constitution, no blueprint, just bruised pride and rising panic. They didn't trust each other. Each colony had its own dialect, economy, ego. Their only common ground, they'd all been insulted. So what did they do? They drafted an appeal to the king, organized a boycott of British goods, agreed to meet again if Britain responded with contempt. And guess what Britain did? Then came 1775, and with it, the battles of Lexington and Concord. The first shots, the first blood, the end of silence, the beginning of war. So in May 1775, they met again, the Second Continental Congress. This time, no illusions. I was there now, and let me tell you, it was a circus scented with destiny. Some wanted peace, some whispered of independence, some argued for an army, others wanted French help. Many just feared being hanged. Every vote came with the same question. But what if we lose? We all knew, if we don't hang together, we will surely hang separately. And then came the decisions, the kind historians love. They created the Continental Army with George Washington as its commander. Quiet, stern, unshakable. They prepared for war with warehouses, gunpowder, and spies. And most importantly, they began to utter the unthinkable, independence. But let's be honest, most of us weren't ready for a clean break. We wanted respect, rights, recognition, not war, not sovereignty, not a republic. Even I, Franklin, resisted the word independence. It felt absurd, like someone asking you to give up land and live in the sky. But every reply from London pushed us closer to the edge. Every new troop, every new tax, every insult stripped the illusions away. A republic? Well, if the only alternative is humiliation, then let's take our chances. Independence wasn't declared. It was squeezed out by fear, loss, and rage. Next time, I'll tell you how the Declaration was written and why the most iconic text in American history began with a lie we all desperately wanted to believe. We wrote the Declaration in ink, but we signed it in fear. Picture the room. Heat, the stench of sweat, ink, and wax. The doors are locked. The windows are covered. Outside, war. Inside, a few dozen men arguing whether they should publicly declare themselves enemies of the most powerful empire on earth. This was not an outburst of liberty. It was a survival maneuver. July 1st, 1776, the first vote. The question on the table, are we still British or are we something else? History loves tidy myths, but in truth, the debates lasted 2 days. Delegates hesitated. Pennsylvania was split. New York abstained. Some wanted more time. Maybe Britain would still come to its senses. I, Franklin, sat and listened, and one thought kept pounding in my head. We're all going to hang, but better for freedom than for silence. Finally, on July the 2nd, the vote. 12 colonies voted yes. New York abstained, but everyone knew the die was cast. John Adams called it the birthday of America. But the world remembers July 4th, when the actual document was adopted, the Declaration of Independence, a text that would become myth, a manifesto, a legend. The author, Thomas Jefferson, young, eloquent, reserved. He wrote fast and full of fire. One line read, "All men are created equal." I, Franklin, edited him, softened the preaching, trimmed the rage, and yes, we struck the passage about slavery. It accused the king of perpetuating the slave trade. True? Absolutely. But if we kept it, the South would walk. "All men are created equal," we wrote, while slaves toiled in our kitchens and fields. It was a lie we hoped one day would be true. The text was elegant. For the first time, the colonies called themselves free and independent states. The British king was no longer a sovereign, but a tyrant. Enlightenment ideals were turned into political ammunition. It was a poetic war, written in legal prose, and then the signatures. You imagine a noble scene, don't you? Now picture this instead. Each man signing that paper knew he was risking his life, property, and family, knew that if we lost, this would be Exhibit A in a trial for treason. knew that the British fleet was already en route, and still they signed. John Hancock. In bold, proud letters, I signed, calmly, like a notary. The rest followed, quietly. There was no cheering, just silence. Because freedom isn't euphoria. It's responsibility. We signed the Declaration, but we didn't know if we could defend it. Next time, I'll tell you how I sailed for France. Not as a diplomat, but as a beggar with ideas. I was there to buy gunpowder, allies, and a future. America had been declared, but not yet born. Sometimes, to win a war, all you need is to know which port the finance minister prefers. When I was appointed ambassador to France, I brought no army, no money, no guarantees. What I had was a tired wig, a suitcase full of ideas, and the most dangerous weapon in the age of empires, an old man's charm. I arrived in Paris. The city sparkled. France was free in manners but stiff in power. King Louis XVI had no idea he'd lose his head in a few years, but for now he ruled the most elegant court in Europe. I was just an aging printer from a non-existent country. My title sounded like satire. Representative of the United States of America. There was no such place yet on any map. But I knew what I was doing. France was Britain's greatest rival, and if we could turn their hatred into our muskets, we had a chance to live. But first, I had to charm the court. I didn't look like a diplomat. I didn't speak like a diplomat. I didn't hunt or dance or recite Versailles etiquette. But I could tell stories. I listened. I smiled. I became a fashion icon. Women styled their hair a la Franklin. Philosophers invited me to salons. Aristocratic ladies hosted music evenings where sonatas played and revolutions were whispered. Meanwhile, I conducted the most dangerous negotiations of my life. Minister Vergennes was clever and cautious. He wanted America to win, but he feared we'd lose. If so, France would be betting on rebels, not a nation. So I painted him a picture. The British were exhausted. The colonies were united. A lie. The people supported independence. Partly true. All we needed was a signal from France. Eventually, they gave it, but carefully. First came money and weapons, secretly via a fake company, Rodrigue Hortalès and Co. Then military advisors, including the young Marquis de Lafayette. And finally, after our victory at Saratoga, an official alliance in 1778. That meant one thing. Britain was now fighting a two-front war. The U.S. had a navy, loans, and legitimacy. And I had a very real reason to pour a glass. You think it was easy? I begged for help from people who had never seen America. I convinced kings to invest in a republic with no government, no army, no borders. I sold them a dream, and strangely enough, they bought it. We didn't win because we were stronger. We won because Britain stood alone, and we didn't. But even with allies, armies, and a flag, we still weren't a nation. Next time, I'll tell you what happened after victory. How America was born in chaos, with debt, infighting, and betrayal. Because winning independence isn't the same as becoming free. Victory isn't the end. It's just the day they stop trying to kill you in public. The Treaty of Paris was signed. The war was over. Britain had recognized the independence of the United States of America. We had won. Now let me tell you the part they don't print on commemorative coins. We weren't ready. The colonies Now, states didn't trust one another. The treasury was empty. The army hadn't been paid. Citizens were angry, exhausted. The streets were restless. And on paper, we had little more than hope and a nice new name. I returned from Paris and found chaos. There was no real government, no constitution yet. Each state had its own laws, its own currency, its own vision. This wasn't a country, it was a prototype of one. General Washington, our very own Cincinnatus, gave up power, a noble gesture, and a dangerous one. Because power once released doesn't just vanish, it seeks new hands, and not always the right ones. We had no idea that it's easier to start a new empire than to avoid becoming one. And now, the truths we avoided. We won a war for freedom, but kept slavery. We declared equality, but gave the vote to few. We built a republic, but had no idea what that really meant. I, Franklin, was already an old man. I watched the young men build the Constitution and argue the same way we did in '76. I signed papers. I smiled for portraits. But inside, I was afraid, because freedom isn't a document. It's a burden. You have a republic, I told a lady outside the convention, if you can keep it. That wasn't a joke. It was a warning. Today, America is mighty. But at its core still echoes the same question. What does it mean to be free? Not just to beat a king, but to resist the urge to crown a new one. We didn't create utopia. We created a possibility. And that, my friends, is the most any revolution can ever truly give you. If you've enjoyed this journey through the founding of a nation, told not with marble statues, but with ink, sweat, and a touch of sarcasm, subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? And what time is it over there? We love knowing where in the world our stories land.